Another way that plants can reproduce is sexually. So that is what this vodcast is on. In the Bible, God says, and I want to read these verses, in Genesis 1, God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed." Remember my seed study? We're studying about seeds. "And the fruit tree that yields fruit." We're going to see where that fruit comes from in sexual reproduction. "According to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth. And the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed, according to its kind." That means tulips reproduce after tulips, oak trees after oak trees. "And the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself, according to its kind. And God saw that it was good." And all these plants were created on the third day of creation. Sexual reproduction occurs when a plant's sperm combines with a plant's ovum. That's any kind of sexual reproduction. It's sperm uniting with ovum. Asexual does not have the gametes or gametes. It just has the different structures like a spore. The resulting zygote, that's the result of fertilization between a sperm and an ovum. The resulting zygote grows into the plant. And what's going to be true genetically about these plants? They are going to have a mixture, a combination, half and half, half from one parent, half from the other. So this is where we get a lot of genetic variety. Unlike seedless plants, the haploid generation of a seed plant is within the diploid tissue. Now, you don't need to write anything down on this slide, but remember what haploid is. It's one set of chromosomes. The haploid number is a sperm. It has half the number of chromosomes. And the haploid number of the ovum is also haploid. It has half. Like if it was a human, it'd have 23 instead of 46. And a plant depends upon the plant, on how many it has. So it says that these haploid plants, seeds, excuse me, they're not seeds yet. These haploid cells, the sperm and the ovum, is coming from diploid tissue. So there's some organ, reproductive organ, that has the ability to carry out, and you remember what process produces the gametes? Meiosis. So meiosis is where a diploid cell can produce haploid cells. So separate diploid male and female reproductive structures, and we're going to learn that in the male, that's the stamen, and in the female, your book calls it the pistil, some books call it carpels. And that's the reproductive structures, and that's where the sperm are made and where the ova are made. In plants, gametes are produced in flowers, cones, or other structures. You do need to know the first statement there, that flowerless seed plants are known as gymnosperms, and they're the ones that produce cones instead of flowers. So their seeds are in cones instead of flowers. So you do need to know the last statement as well. So the most common gymnosperms are the conifers, the pines, the ferns, the cypresses, redwoods, yews, and we've studied about those. So there's a cone, and we're going to learn that there actually are male and female cones. And the one that you see on the right is the female cone. The one you see that's yellow on the lower left, those are the male cones. So obviously they would be producing the sperm, and the female cone would be producing the ova. So you need to know the two names of the types of cones found on conifers or gymnosperms, and that's the staminate and the ovulate or ovulate. And you'll see the stamen is the male reproductive, and ova, of course, or the ovary, is the female. So that's where they get these names from. So staminate cones are the ones that produce pollen. That's all you need to know. You see two different kinds here. It depends upon the type of plant on what it's going to look like. The one you're probably most familiar with is the lower right, which is from like a pine. So small green or inconspicuous, they're near the tips of the branches, and they're the ones that have been shedding the yellow pollen everywhere. So we saw that early April where all the pollen was being released by the gymnosperms. The ovulate or ovulate cones, they are the ones that you're more familiar with, and the one at the bottom is from a sweet gum tree, or it's like the sweet gum tree, and then the regular cones that you're familiar with are at the top. So the seed-producing cones, they're larger than the staminate cones, and they're woody structures, and the seeds develop between the cone scales. And they're usually winged so that they can be manipulated and blown with the wind to spread them. You do not need to know the life cycle of the pine tree, but this is what happens in their life. Pine trees produce cones, male and female, and then the pollen is carried by the wind. That's why they release so much pollen and it goes everywhere. So that pollen is carried by wind from the staminate cones where it's made to the ovulate or ovulate cones where it's going to land, and then inside the pollen is the sperm, and it's going to unite with an ovum and produce the zygote in a seed. So the pollen lands on the open scales of the ovulate cone, and the scales then close tightly. In many pines, the cone begins to point downward, and that's to keep that pollen in there until it has a chance for the sperm to unite with the ova. The ovum is fertilized, and of course we know a fertilized ovum then produces a zygote. When the seeds are mature and environmental conditions are right, that's when the little cones will open up and let their seeds be released, because now they have little wings on them usually, and that will blow them all over the place. And here's a diagram showing you what we just talked about. So in any kind of sexual reproduction of a plant, you have two important processes, and this is the order that they must occur. There has to be pollination first, and then fertilization. Now with seed plants, which are the angiosperms, so know that flowering seed plants are called angiosperms, which we've learned, so that's a review. That is where the flower is going to have the reproductive structures, not the cone or the cone-like structures, but flowers. So we're going to learn the part of a flower, all the different parts of a flower. Flowers have one primary function. Of course, they give us a lot of source of beauty, and they help the bees and all that kind of stuff, get them, the nectar so they can make their honey and all that kind of stuff. But the key, the reason they're here, the primary purpose, is for sexual reproduction, to produce the seeds which contain the little embryo so that plant can continue on from generation to generation. A flower's shape, its color, its smell, everything about it is designed by God to carry out that process of getting the ova fertilized and produce seeds. That's it. Their whole design is all for that. Now, by the way, not always do the flowers look like what we think of with flowers. Some are missing, and we'll be talking about that, like tulips, they have petals and stuff. Well, there's some flowers, like on grass, that does not have those petals, so you don't recognize them as being flowers. So a flower contains a flower contains four different types of appendages, and we're going to talk about these. You don't need to know it for a listing question, but you need to know what they are. The sepals, the petals, the stamens, and the carpels. Those are the four main parts of a flower. And when they're arranged, and again, you don't need to know this for a quiz, the outermost would be the sepals. Then you take those away, you would have the petals. You take those away, you'd have the stamens. And then you take those away, and centrally located, you would have the female reproductive part of the flower, which is the carpel. Now the pedestal is what we commonly refer to as a stem, like if you're holding a rose and the thing that has the thorns on it, we call that a stem of the flower. That's actually called the pedestal. And so it's the flower stalk. It's what's holding up the flower. It's what's supporting and bearing the flower. The receptacle is actually where all the floral parts are going to be connected. They're holding them. That's where they develop from when we have a flower bud. It's going to be inside there. So if you look at all the petals, and you look at the sepals, and you look at the stamen and stigma and all that kind of stuff, the pistil, it's all going to be connected to what's called the receptacle. Now sometimes the receptacle has ovaries inside of it, and sometimes the ovary is on top of it, like in this picture. The sepals are what covered the flower when it was a bud. So it's the leaf-like outermost structure. Sometimes after the flower blooms, they just wilt away. They become brown, shriveled up, and are taken away. Sometimes they're left on there, but their job is done when the flower blooms. So it's the leaf-like outermost structure of a flower. It's usually green. There's some exceptions, like the tulip, where God made the sepals the same color as the petals, so it's hard to tell the difference between them. When you have all of the sepals, and you count all the sepals on one particular flower, that collectively is called the calyx. And here's a real picture. Look at the purple and follow the purple all the way to the end where the receptacle is, and see those little green-like structures? Those are the sepals. So it protects the floral parts when they're developing in the bud. The petal you're familiar with. He loves me not. He loves me, he loves me not. Or she loves me, she loves me not. So they're any of the brightly colored leaf-like structures. They're often the largest and the most colorful because their job is to attract insects and to attract things, to get them, and even birds, to get them to come and transfer pollen from one flower to the next. Collectively, they have a name as well, and they're called the corolla when you take all of the petals on one particular flower. And their job, as I said, is to attract insects, attract animals, so that they can get their pollen transferred from one flower to another. And it's also benefiting the animals by getting the nectar. The stamen, excuse me, the stamen is the male reproductive organ. And so it's producing the pollen, which inside the pollen is the sperm. So male organ produces sperm, but it's called the stamen. There's two parts to the stamen. There's the filament and the anther. The filament is actually the stalk. It's what's holding the main part, the part that is actually making the pollen. And so the filament is the slender, elongated stalk. It's what bears the anther. It's what holds the anther up. But the anther is where the pollen is actually being produced. So that is the key thing about the anther. It's at the top, and it's producing. It's actually a sac-like, and a knobby sac, and it produces pollen. And pollen varies according to what type of plant it is, because pollen from a tulip is not going to do anything if it lands on a rose. And rose pollen is not going to do anything if it lands on a daffodil. So they are uniquely shaped and designed for each type of plant that they will pollinate. And you can see why some maybe cause allergic reactions to it, because some of them have, little spikes and everything on them. Now the female part of the flower, it depends on what book, the female organ. Your book calls it the pistil. Some other books call it carpels. So I want you to know either pistil or carpel. Those are the female. And it's made up of three parts we're going to look, and it's centrally located because the whole purpose of that flower is to get that sperm down into the ovary so that it can pollinate and then fertilize the little ovum and become a seed. The parts of the carpel are the stigma, the style, and the ovary. That's starting from the top going down to the bottom. The tip is usually flattened. It's sticky because its job is to receive pollen. So God's going to design it that way to ensure that pollen's going to get up there and stick. And then once that pollen sticks, then of course the pollination process goes through, which is making a pollen tube and all of that, which you'll see. The stalk-like structure, which is holding up the stigma so that it can get all the pollen that it can collect, that is called the style. And the ovary is where, the ovary is the actual place where the ova are made. And that's easy to remember because that was true in animals and true in humans. Ovary is where the ova are. But there's something unique inside this ovary that animals do not have. They have another part which actually is going to become the seeds if they get fertilized. So that's why it says it contains the future seeds, and that is called the ovules. So the ovary, as I was saying, can sometimes be in the receptacle and sometimes not. You don't need to know this for the quiz. But the superior ovary is when the receptacle is above, when the ovary is above the receptacle, and then when the ovary is inside the receptacle, that is called an inferior one. Here's the ovules. You need to know about them, and you can see, look at how they are shaped. They sort of look like the shape of a seed. They are called future seeds because they have the potential to become a seed if the ova are fertilized. But the ova are actually inside the ovules. So get the picture. There's an ovary, that inside the ovary there are ovules, and inside the ovules are the ova. And in watermelon, you know, all those little white seeds that you see, they are the ones that weren't developed. They weren't fertilized, because the ones that are dark, they actually have the embryo in them. The ones that are the white and shriveled and little, those are the ones that did not become seeds. When we have all of those four basic parts, the sepals, the petals, the stamens, and the pistils, then we have what is called a complete flower. But if it's missing one or more of those parts, it is called an incomplete. So that makes sense. An example of an incomplete flower would be grass. Another example of an incomplete flower is the corn. You don't see any petals, you don't see any sepals. The poinsettia, too, is a incomplete flower. They lack petals. And you think, well, they got petals. They're red or sometimes white. No, those are actually special leaves called bracts, and they are not petals, so they're an incomplete flower. And you don't need to know bracts. It's just some extra information. You do need to know there are two kinds of incomplete flowers that when they lack one of the reproductive parts. If they lack the reproductive organ, the male one, they are called pistillate flowers because they contain the pistil, but not the stamen. So they are female flowers. And then the staminate flowers are the ones that are incomplete flowers because they are lacking the pistils. So they are just male flowers. You probably didn't know that some flowers, now not all of them, a lot of plants and flowers have all of the parts. But there are some plants that have male flowers and female flowers. Here's an example of a staminate, one that is missing the female. They lack the pistils, they have the stamen, it's the male flower. And then its counterpart right here is the female. And you can see in the middle it has not a pistil, not a stamen, but a pistil. And it's shaped differently, that little green thing. And then go back, let's go look at the male. See how the male, it has the little stuff making pollen. You can see some of the pollen all around it. So that's a male flower, this is a female flower on the same plant. Now, when we have incomplete flowers, here's a good example on corn, because we have a male flower and a female flower on a stalk of corn. The male flower is the tassels at the top, and then the female flowers are the actual ear of corn with those little stringy things at the top. That's a female flower. And of course, all the corn in there are the seeds when they were fertilized. When we have a plant that contains both male and female flowers on the same plant, you need to know that's called a monoecious plant. You actually don't need to know this for the quiz, but that's what they're called. Mono means one. Monoecious plant is one plant has both male and female flowers, and that is an example, corn. Sometimes we have dioecious plants. Dioecious means it takes two to tangle. You have one plant that has only female flowers on it and one plant that has only male flowers. So if you don't have two plants, you never have baby ones. So that is called dioecious plants. And if you don't know that, then let's say you get a plum tree. And I'm not sure which trees. I know willow trees are dioecious. So if you wanted more willow trees, and like a weeping willow, and you only had the one that produced the male flowers, you'd never get, unless there was some within a certain radius, you'd never get little baby weeping willows. The only way you get it is to have two different trees, the male, the one that has the staminate flowers, and the one that has the pistillate flowers. Now this is going to tell you about the pollen. The pollen grain is forming inside the male, which we looked at. Remember what part? The anther. The pollen grains produce sperm, so that's what's inside. They're carried to the female, that's called pollination, and they're carried by wind, by animals, by gravity, that's just falling down, or by water. And then the female reproductive structure is where the ova are, but the ova are inside an ovule, which is inside the ovary. And here's showing you the reproductive parts of pollination, the parts that they have to go to. Pollination is simply pollen traveling from where it's made, the male, the stamen part of the cone, or cones, or this could be with flowers as well, to the female. And so let's watch this little.
In the cones, cells divide by meiosis to produce gametophyte plant structures. Eggs and food storage tissue are produced in the ovule. Two sperm form inside each pollen grain. Each pollen grain has tiny wings that help carry it to the female cone. When it reaches the female cone, a pollen tube grows, and one sperm fertilizes the egg. This process may take up to 15 months. The zygote produced following fertilization grows into an embryo. The embryo is a new, immature sporophyte plant. One winged pine seed develops from each ovule. The seeds are eventually released from the female cone and grow into a mature sporophyte plant.
And that's how it occurs in the pine cones. So pollination, you need to know, is the transfer of pollen from where it's made, the anther, to where it needs to go, the stigma. And the anther, remember, is the top of the stamen, and the stigma is the top of the pistil or the carpel. There's two types, and you need to know this for a listing question. Two types of pollination. Self-pollination occurs within the same plant. So pollen doesn't have to be it can go from one flower to the same flower on that plant, or it can go from one flower to another flower on that same plant, but it only takes one plant to produce the seeds because they can self-pollinate. Now cross-pollination is where it has to take two, even though they may have both male and female structures, such as corn. Corn has to cross-pollinate. If you just have one stalk of corn, you'll never get ears of corn with seed in it. You'll get no seeds. It takes cross-pollination. So the pollen has to go from the anther of one plant to the to the stigma of another plant. And here's showing you in A, that's self-pollination. And then when it goes from A to B, different plants, that's cross-pollination. So how do seed plants reproduce? And here you see the little babies inside the seed, the embryo. And this is what is produced after pollination and fertilization. First pollination, because that's getting the sperm to the female structure. Then pollination grows pollen tubes and takes the sperm down into the ovary and then into an ovule. And then fertilization, where the sperm is going to unite with the ovum and it produces the zygote, and the zygote is what develops into the little baby plant, the little embryo. And you can see two of them here. We're going to study the seeds for your lab, but you don't need to know it for a quiz or a test. You just need to know that the zygote is where the embryo came from. An embryo, it's got its food supply, which remember are called cotyledons, and it's got a protective covering called the seed coat, and we're also going to learn the different parts of the embryo in our seed study. So after pollination, boom, big changes take place after pollination. When that pollen tube gets that sperm down so it can unite with the ovum, drastic changes start taking place in the flower. You no longer need sepals. They might have been gone a long time ago. You don't need petals. You don't need stamens. None of that stuff. You are actually left eventually with the ovum. Now here's what happens. The fertilized ovum, of course, remember, is the zygote. It grows into, so the zygote grows into the embryo plant. What does the ovule grow into? It changes and develops into the seed. And then the ovary develops into fruit. And that's why botanists call tomatoes fruit. And we call, cucumbers are fruit. And we don't refer to those, in the store as fruit because it's not a ripened ovary. And they don't take it like a biologist. So we call, or a botanist, we call a ripened ovary fruit. So that's why some vegetables can be called fruit. Now, like corn, it's not fruit. Why? It's the seed. Lima beans, you're eating the seed. Peas, you're eating the seed. But green beans, you're not only eating the seeds, but you're also eating the ovary, the ripened fruit. And of course, fruit. Whenever you eat fruit, like an orange, apple, whatever, that is a ripened ovary. It only developed because we had pollination and fertilization occur. Otherwise, you would not get the fruit. And here's showing you with the angiosperms the process to produce the little baby plant. And so we've taken it from a seed, not from the flower, and we've seen what happens with the seeds.
Pollination happens when pollen grains from the anthers land on the sticky stigma of a pistil. The pollen tube grows from the pollen grain down through the style and into the ovary to the ovule. The sperm then travels down the pollen tube and fertilizes the egg. This zygote develops into the plant embryo. Parts of the ovule become the seed's coat and stored food. The ovary and other flower parts will form a fruit that surrounds the seed.
And that's what occurs in the angiosperms as compared to the gymnosperms. A person who is an agricultural scientist who specializes in flowers, fruits, vegetables, shrubs, they are known as a horticulturist.